They dragged him into the town square on a splintered wagon, a broken giant of a man, paralyzed and left for dead. Handing him to a desperate widow was supposed to be a cruel joke to break her spirit. Instead, it forged the greatest legend the Wyoming Territory ever saw. The dust never truly settled in Oak Haven, Wyoming. It hung in the air like a bitter promise, coating the saloons, the mercantiles, and the weary faces of the folks trying to scratch a life out of the unforgiving earth in the autumn of 1878. For Martha Caldwell, known to everyone as Mattie, the dust felt like a burial shroud. It had been 14 months since her husband, William, died from a sudden bout of cholera, leaving her alone with 100 head of cattle and the deed to the Iron Creek Ranch. It was prime grazing land, boasting the only reliable freshwater spring for 10 miles in any direction. And because of that water, Hiram P. Lockwood wanted it. Lockwood was a man who owned half the town and held the mortgages on the other half. He was a wealthy, ruthless opportunist who saw Mattie's widowhood not as a tragedy, but as a business opportunity. For a year he had squeezed her. He cut off her line of credit at the supply store, bribed the freight drivers to bypass her shipments of winter feed, and sent his ranch hands to subtly intimidate her. But Mattie possessed a spine made of Wyoming granite. She refused to sell. Lockwood's frustration finally boiled over during the annual Founders' Day gathering. Tradition dictated that the town host a labor auction, where able-bodied men volunteered a week of heavy labor to assist the widows and the elderly, with the meager bidding proceeds going to the church. Mattie desperately needed a strong back to help repair the southern corral before the winter freezes set in. The timber was too heavy for her to lift alone. She had scraped together $5, a small fortune for her at the time, to buy the time of a sturdy ranch hand. But Lockwood had rigged the draw. The town gathered around the wooden platform outside the assayer's office. Mayor Higgins, squarely in Lockwood's pocket, stood at the podium. Mattie stood in the front row, her dress worn but meticulously clean, her chin held high. "Next up, we have a special lot for the widow Caldwell," Mayor Higgins announced, a sly smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. She put in her $5 for a strong, capable man. "Bring him out, boys." 2 of Lockwood's burly enforcers hauled a low, flatbed cart up the wooden ramp. A heavy canvas tarp covered whatever lay on top of it. The crowd hushed, a ripple of uneasy murmurs spreading through the onlookers. Lockwood stepped forward, his thumbs tucked into his expensive silk vest. "We know you've been struggling out there all alone, Mattie," Lockwood said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy, loud enough for the whole square to hear. "We thought you needed a real mountain of a man to help you hold on to Iron Creek, so we found you one." He yanked the tarp back. A collective gasp echoed through the square, followed by scattered, cruel laughter. Lying on the cart, strapped to a crude wooden backboard, was Jedediah Boone. Jed was a legend in the high country, a fiercely independent mountain man who trapped timber wolves and tracked bear through the jagged peaks of Blacktooth Ridge. But 3 months ago, a catastrophic rock slide near the old Peterson mining claim had crushed him. The town doctor, Amos Henderson, had managed to save his life, but Jed's spine was severely damaged. From the waist down, the giant was completely paralyzed. Without family or funds, he had been dumped in a squalid lean-to behind Lockwood's livery, surviving on table scraps and waiting for the winter to finally take him. He lay there now, his massive frame wasted, his thick, dark beard matted with filth. But his eyes, storm-grey and burning with a terrifying, humiliated rage, swept over the laughing crowd. He was a caged, broken predator put on display for town amusement. "There he is, Mattie," Lockwood crowed, playing to the laughing crowd. "A week of his labor, all yours. I'm sure he'll have those fences mended in no time. Unless, of course, you find the burden too heavy and want to sign that deed over to me right now." It was a masterclass in psychological cruelty. Lockwood intended to humiliate Mattie, proving she was utterly helpless, whilst saddling her with a crippled man she couldn't possibly feed or care for, forcing her to finally break. The laughter stung Mattie's cheeks like a physical slap. She looked at Mayor Higgins, who wouldn't meet her eyes. She looked at the women she attended church with, who were suddenly deeply interested in the hems of their skirts. Then she looked at Jedediah. He didn't look at her with pleading eyes. He looked at her with pure defiance, a silent challenge daring her to pity him. Mattie didn't break. The public humiliation didn't shatter her spirit. It ignited a blazing inferno in her chest. She realized in that moment the true ugliness of the town she had called home. Slowly, deliberately, Mattie walked up the wooden steps of the platform. She didn't look at Lockwood. She walked straight to the flatbed cart. "I paid my $5, Mattie said, her voice ringing out like a cracked whip across the suddenly silent square. She pulled a worn hunting knife from her belt and cut the ropes binding Jed to the display board. "Help me get him in my wagon." "Now, Mattie, be reasonable," Lockwood started, his smile faltering. "I said," Mattie interrupted, turning her piercing gaze on Lockwood's enforcers, "help me get him in my wagon. He's my responsibility now." Nobody laughed as the two men, cowed by the sheer force of her anger, lifted the heavy board and carried the paralyzed mountain man to the back of Mattie's buckboard. Mattie climbed into the driver's seat, took up the reins, and snapped them hard over the mules' backs. She drove out of Oakhaven without looking back, a widow and a paralyzed man, completely alone against the coming winter. The ride to Iron Creek was brutally silent. The wagon wheels hit every rut in the hardened earth, sending jolts of agonizing pain through Jedediah's shattered body. He bit the inside of his cheek until he tasted copper, refusing to make a sound. He had prayed for death in the squalor of the livery. Now he was entirely at the mercy of a desperate woman. It was the ultimate indignity. When they finally arrived at the homestead, the reality of Lockwood's cruel joke set in. Mattie was exhausted, her hands blistered, but she had to somehow move a 220-pound paralyzed man from the wagon into the house. "Just leave me in the barn," Jed rasped, his voice raw from disuse. It was the first time he had spoken. "Give me a revolver and one cartridge. I'll save us both the trouble." Mattie stopped, unhitching the mules, and walked to the back of the wagon. She leaned over the tailgate, her face inches from his. "I didn't pay $5 for a corpse, Mr. Boone, and I am not about to let Hiram Lockwood win. You are going into the house." Using a system of heavy ropes, a sturdy oak plank, and sheer, agonizing leverage, it took them 2 hours to get him inside and onto William's old bed on the ground floor. By the end of it, both were soaked in sweat, breathing heavily, and intensely aware of the impossible mountain they had to climb. The first month was a nightmare. The physical toll of caring for a paralyzed adult was immense. Mattie had to bathe him, manage his bodily functions, and turn him constantly to prevent bed sores. For Jed, the loss of his independence was a mental torture worse than his crushed spine. He was bitter, lashing out with sharp, venomous insults, trying to drive her away. He threw plates of food against the wall. He refused to speak for days on end. But Mattie never flinched. When he yelled, she calmly cleaned up the mess. When he despaired, she ignored his pleas for a quick death. She treated him not with the pity he despised, but with a grueling, relentless practicality. "You may not have legs," she told him one evening, slapping a bundle of raw, untreated leather onto his chest. "But your arms are thicker than fence posts, and your eyes work just fine. I need these harnesses repaired by tomorrow morning, or neither of us eats. figure it out. It was a turning point. Mattie realized that to save Jed's mind, she had to give him a purpose. She brought the work to him. She hauled the heavy grinding stone into the bedroom so he could sharpen all the ranch's tools. She bought him specialized awls and heavy thread from a traveling peddler, and Jed, who had spent decades repairing his own gear in the wilderness, began fixing the ranch's tack. Slowly, the bitterness in his grey eyes was replaced by a smouldering focus. He began exercising his upper body, using cast-iron stove weights. His chest and arms, already massive from his years in the mountains, became corded with thick, terrifying muscle. Seeing his progress, Mattie spent 3 nights designing something in her head. She tore down an old rocking chair and, using scrap iron and heavy bolts, constructed a reinforced wheeled chair with thick, sturdy armrests. It wasn't elegant, but it was practically indestructible. When she finally rolled it to his bedside, Jed stared at it for a long time before looking up at her, an unspoken gratitude hanging thick in the air. Lockwood, meanwhile, had grown impatient. Word had reached town that Mattie hadn't broken under the strain of the cripple. Winter was mere weeks away, and Lockwood needed her gone before the snow locked down the valley. He decided to force her hand. He dispatched his foreman, a vicious brute named Silas Cobb, along with 3 hired guns. Their orders were simple. Wait until the dead of night, cut the southern wire, run off her remaining cattle and burn the barn. Let them freeze or starve. It was a moonless Tuesday night when Cobb and his men crept onto the Iron Creek property. The wind was howling off the mountains, masking the sound of their horses. They dismounted near the barn, carrying kerosene lanterns wrapped in burlap. They thought it was going to be easy work. They thought the widow was asleep, and the mountain man was useless in his bed. They didn't know that Jedediah Boone suffered from insomnia, a lingering side effect of his nerve damage. They didn't know that Mattie had wheeled him out onto the darkened wraparound porch because the cold night air eased the phantom pains in his legs. And they certainly didn't know that resting across the armrests of his custom wheelchair was a modified .50 caliber Sharps buffalo rifle. Sitting perfectly still in the pitch black, Jed watched the shadows detach themselves from the tree line. His mountain-honed senses picked up the faint smell of kerosene on the wind. His powerful arms lifted the heavy rifle as easily as a man might lift a walking cane. Without the use of his legs to brace himself, the recoil of a Sharps would normally knock a man backward. But Jed had lashed his thick leather belt around his waist and the back of the iron-reinforced chair, anchoring himself like a ship's cannon. Cobb struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating his scarred face as he prepared to light a torch. The night exploded. The roar of the .50 caliber rifle was deafening, a dragon's breath lighting up the porch. The massive slug hit the wooden post mere inches from Cobb's head, showering him in deadly, razor-sharp splinters. Cobb screamed, dropping the match. Before the rustlers could even draw their weapons, the lever action of the Sharps clacked with terrifying speed. A second shot blew the kerosene lantern clean out of a hired gun's hand, erupting into a ball of fire that spooked the tied horses. "Next one takes the foreman's head off," Jed roared from the darkness, his voice booming like thunder rolling down the canyon. It didn't sound like a crippled man. It sounded like the wrath of the mountain itself. Panic seized Lockwood's men. Unseen, outgunned by what sounded like artillery, and facing a man who clearly had eyes in the dark, their courage broke. They scrambled over each other, diving into the brush, leaving their mounts behind, and running back toward town on foot. The door to the house flew open, Mattie rushing out with a double-barreled shotgun, her hair unbound and her eyes wild. She found Jed sitting calmly on the porch, the barrel of the Sharps smoking in the crisp autumn air. He unlatched the belt from around his waist and looked at her, a fierce, genuine smile cracking through his thick beard for the first time in months. "Looks like your southern corral is safe tonight, Mattie," he said softly. Mattie lowered her shotgun, staring at the shattered lantern burning out in the dirt, and then at the broken man who had just defended her home. The cruel joke the town had played had backfired. Lockwood hadn't given her a burden. He had given her a guardian. And as she looked at Jedediah Boone, Mattie knew they were no longer just surviving. They were going to war. The morning after the attack, the first major blizzard of the season slammed into the Wyoming territory. The sky turned the color of a bruised iron skillet, and the wind screamed down from Blacktooth Ridge, burying Oak Haven and the surrounding plains under 4 feet of relentless, blinding snow. In town, Hiram P. Lockwood sat by a roaring fire in his opulent parlor, sipping expensive bourbon. He assumed the cold was doing his dirty work. Cobb, his humiliated foreman, had staggered back the night before, bleeding from a wooden splinter the size of a railroad spike lodged in his shoulder, babbling about a one-man army in the dark. Lockwood had fired him on the spot. He figured the widow and the cripple might have gotten lucky once, but they couldn't shoot a blizzard. With the roads impassable until April, he was certain he would find 2 frozen corpses at Iron Creek come the spring thaw. He was entirely wrong. Inside the sturdy walls of the Iron Creek homestead, a strange and powerful alchemy was taking place. The blizzard didn't entomb them. It insulated them from the poison of the town. Locked away from the cruel stares and whispered insults, Mattie and Jedediah forged a partnership born of pure, unadulterated survival. The living room had been transformed. Mattie had dragged William's heavy oak dining table into the corner, and Jed had claimed it as his workbench. Surrounded by leather scraps, metal files, gun oil, and the faint, ever-present scent of wood smoke, Jed became the architect of their defense. He realized that his lack of mobility was his greatest weakness, so he engineered ways to eliminate it. Using parts scavenged from a broken McCormick Reaper, he modified his wheelchair. He added thick, leather-bound grips to the wheels for better traction, widened the axle for stability, and most impressively, designed a heavy iron swivel mount that bolted directly to the right armrest. It was a cradle perfectly shaped to hold the heavy barrel of his .50 caliber sharps, taking the weight off his arms and allowing him to pivot the massive weapon with the nudge of a shoulder. "You're turning that chair into a war wagon, Mr. Boone," Mattie remarked one evening. She was sitting by the hearth, mending a torn wool blanket, the firelight catching the auburn highlights in her hair. Jed paused, a heavy steel file resting in his calloused hand. The anger that used to harden his storm-grey eyes had slowly burned away, replaced by a deep, quiet respect. "If Lockwood comes back when the snow melts, Mattie, he won't send 4 men with lanterns. He'll send 20 with Winchesters. We have to be ready." "We will be," she said softly, but with a conviction that rivaled his own. The harsh winter months stripped away their walls. They were 2 broken people, one physically shattered, the other widowed and besieged, finding immense strength in their shared defiance. The physical boundaries of caring for Jed forced an intimacy that neither had expected. One bitter night in late January, the temperature plummeted to 30 below. Despite the roaring fire, the drafty house was freezing. Jed was shivering violently in his bed on the ground floor, his paralyzed legs unable to generate heat or warn him of the encroaching frostbite. Mattie, exhausted from chopping wood all afternoon, saw his lips turning blue. Without a word, she dragged her own mattress from upstairs, laying it right next to his near the hearth. She piled every quilt, pelt, and blanket they owned over them both. "You don't have to do this," Jed mumbled through chattering teeth, his pride still a stubborn, raw thing. "I'm a mountain man. I've slept in snowbanks." "You're a fool if you think I'm letting my best ranch hand freeze to death after I paid $5 whole for him," Mattie fired back, her tone clipped, but her eyes incredibly soft. She reached under the heavy bear pelt and took his massive, freezing hands in hers, rubbing them briskly to restore the circulation. It was in the quiet, frozen dark of that night that the shift finally happened. Jed looked at the fierce, beautiful woman lying beside him, fighting to keep him alive, and he realized the profound truth of his existence. He wasn't half a man. The rock slide had taken his legs, but Mattie Caldwell had given him back his soul. He fell in love with her, not out of gratitude, but out of a profound, overwhelming awe. By late February, their isolation was broken by an unexpected arrival. The hound started baying just before dusk. Jed immediately wheeled himself to the window, sliding the barrel of his sharps into the swivel mount. Out in the driving snow, a lone rider was floundering, leading a second pack horse. The man was half dead from exposure. Mattie bundled up and braved the drift, dragging the man inside. When she brushed the snow from his heavy buffalo coat, she found a silver star pinned to his vest. It was Deputy U.S. Marshal Frank Grouard. Grouard was a real-life legend of the plains, a man who had lived with the Sioux and rode for the federal government out of Cheyenne. He had been tracking a ring of organized cattle rustlers, men he suspected were operating under Hiram Lockwood's payroll, when the blizzard caught him out on the open range. For a week, Grouard recuperated at Iron Creek. He was a quiet, observant man, and what he saw inside the widow's cabin astounded him. He saw a paralyzed man who possessed more upper body strength and mechanical ingenuity than any blacksmith in Cheyenne. He examined Jed's modified wheelchair, his meticulously rebored rifles, and the ingenious system of pulleys Jed had rigged to move himself from the bed to the chair without Mattie's help. "You're a dangerous man, Boone," Marshal Grouard noted one afternoon, inspecting a custom quick-draw holster Jed had fashioned for a Colt Peacemaker designed to be drawn while seated. "And you, Mrs. Caldwell, are a fortress. I've seen army forts with less tactical preparation." "We only want to be left in peace, Marshal," Mattie said, serving him a plate of venison stew. "But Hiram Lockwood won't allow that. He wants this land." Grouard's eyes darkened. "Lockwood is a tick on the hide of this territory. I've been building a case against him for embezzlement and rustling, but he owns the local judge. I need hard proof of his aggression, something I can take directly to Territorial Governor John Wesley Hoyt." Jed looked up from his workbench, his jaw set like an anvil. "When the spring thaw comes, Marshal, Lockwood will bring his own aggression right to our front porch. You want your proof? You just make sure you're around to witness it." Grouard nodded slowly. "I'll ride to Cheyenne the minute the passes are clear. I'll bring back federal warrants. You just hold the line until I get back." "We'll hold it," Jed promised. Late April brought the thaw, turning the Wyoming plains into a sea of thick mud. With the melting snow came the inevitable reckoning. Lockwood had grown paranoid. Rumors that smoke still rose from the Iron Creek chimney drove him to a breaking point. Furious that his cruel joke had survived the winter, he decided to end the game permanently. He rode out in broad daylight with a posse of 18 armed men, clutching a fraudulent foreclosure notice. They thundered up the valley, but as they crested the final ridge overlooking Iron Creek, Lockwood pulled his horse to a sudden halt. The ranch didn't look like a desperate widow's property. It was a formidable redoubt. Over the winter, Jed and Mattie had used heavy timber to build reinforced breastworks around the porch. The ground floor windows were shuttered with thick oak planks featuring firing slits. Lockwood masked his unease. "Spread out!" he barked. "Burn them out! I want that deed!" Inside, the atmosphere was deadly calm. Mattie stood behind a reinforced shutter, a Winchester rifle tucked against her shoulder. Jed sat in his custom wheelchair, flanked by preloaded revolvers. His heavy Sharps rifle rested easily in its swivel mount. "Let them get to the creek bed," Jed commanded, his voice steady. Lockwood's men charged, firing blindly into the sturdy logs. "Now," Jed said. Mattie opened fire, aiming for the dirt in front of the horses. Her shots kicked up geysers of mud, throwing two riders from their saddles. Jed wheeled himself to the front door, kicking it open with a heavy boot attached to a paralyzed leg, acting as a battering ram. He rolled onto the protected porch. The boom of the .50 caliber Sharps silenced the valley. Jed fired and reloaded with terrifying rhythmic speed. He shattered the spokes of Lockwood's supply wagon wheel, then blew the pommel off the saddle of a charging gun hand. The posse panicked. They had expected a crying woman and a helpless cripple. Instead, they faced a fortified bunker, manned by a sharpshooting widow and a mechanized giant, laying down suppressive artillery fire. "Push forward, you cowards!" Lockwood screamed. "It's one man in a chair. One man who's about to end your miserable life." The voice didn't come from the cabin. It came from the ridge. Lockwood whirled around to see U.S. Marshal Frank Grodd atop a roan stallion. A dozen heavily armed federal deputies flanked him. "Drop the weapons," Grodd shouted. "By order of the territorial governor, you are under arrest." Caught between a federal posse and a fortress, the hired guns dropped their rifles. Lockwood sat frozen, his empire crumbling. Grodd rode down to the porch. "I see you held the line, Mr. Boone." Jed reached out, his calloused hand wrapping around Mattie's. "We held it together, Marshal." A month later, the town doctor rode out to Iron Creek for a wedding. Jedediah Boone didn't stand to marry Martha Caldwell, but as he sat in his iron-braced chair looking up at his bride, no man had ever looked taller. Jed went on to design specialized plows he operated from modified wagons, working the land alongside his wife, and became the territory's most sought-after gunsmith. They called him the Pride of the Plains. But Jed knew his true pride was the unyielding widow who bought a broken man for $5 and built an empire out of love and iron. If you loved this story of resilience, defiance, and true love in the harsh Wild West, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, share this incredible tale with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, historical frontier stories every single week. Drop a comment below and let us know your favorite part of Jed and Mattie's legendary stand.